And joining me now is James Batchik, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Europe Centre. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
So, a new Chief of Staff for Volodymyr Zelenskyy. What does this tell us? The appointment of Kyrylo Budanov, Ukraine's top spy, what does this tell us about the appointment to him leading the office of the president?
Well, I and many other analysts I speak with think this is quite a strong choice. It shows the trust that President Zelenskyy is putting into Budanov to translate his previous military successes into this new role. Budanov has earned trust not just in Ukraine, but also with many Western allies by being immensely capable. He has overseen and expanded Ukraine's foreign intelligence and military operations against and in Russia with this war against Ukraine. In particular, he's quite adept at making an impact with the limited tools available in the war where Ukraine has been outgunned and outmanned frequently. He's been in the middle of the kind of daring asymmetric successes, for example, with the attacks in Russia earlier, or the incident in the Kerch Strait Bridge. But all of these together show that he's really a capable handler of these complex tasks, which are strengths that will probably come in handy when he's managing the many challenges facing the Zelenskyy administration right now. But beyond just the management, I think he also has relevant experience to diplomatic negotiations, including, for example, with prisoner exchange negotiations in the past. And I think it would behoove Ukraine to see him in the negotiations with the Americans to come.
You rightly point out that this is a guy understood to have spearheaded attacks, for example, in the heart of Russia, particularly some of those covert advanced attacks and operations. He's also kept close ties, reportedly, with the United States. Are we seeing President Zelenskyy doing everything he can to keep Donald Trump on side and to keep Vladimir Putin's influence away from the White House?
Oh, certainly, yes, without a doubt. This is a continued effort to keep the United States, and in particular Donald Trump, on side. That consideration impacts just about every decision President Zelenskyy makes, including this one to elevate Budanov. We've seen recently Zelenskyy has been working overtime to appeal directly to Donald Trump, especially as Putin continues to try to poison the relations between the two and the entire peace negotiation process that has unfolded in the last few months. And as you mentioned, Budanov's relationship with the West, he also has a relationship with some of the most impressive feats Ukraine has achieved in the war, and Donald Trump has reportedly been quite fascinated with them. So I think Budanov could be well situated to work with the Americans in this U.S. administration going into the future.
You used the words there, poisoning. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin, because in recent days we've heard Russia claim that nuclear missiles are on their way to Belarus. We've heard claims that Ukraine attacked Putin's palace in Novgorod, which the CIA has, of course, dismissed. We've also seen those claims around the strikes in Kherson. Is the Kremlin desperately trying to shift responsibility for these peace negotiations failing?
Yes, they definitely are. And really, this is just more of the same from Putin and from the Russians. We've seen this to be the case with just about every single peace effort Donald Trump has initiated since coming into office early last year. We've seen Putin get on the phone with President Trump before his planned meetings with Zelenskyy to try to paint the Ukrainians as the ones that are standing in the way for peace, and then the Russians are the ones who really have the appetite for peace. But then the Russians, for example, will launch 200 drone strikes against the Ukrainians during this process, or they'll make these claims that the Ukrainians targeted one of Vladimir Putin's residences, as you mentioned, despite the fact that, rightly so, that the CIA has completely dismissed this, and even it looks like the Russians have overstepped here. Donald Trump shared a editorial piece on his True Social account, showing that, or writing that this attack was invented or embellished. That the Putin in Russia has no interest in peace. But then look at the larger picture. Look at the two competing statements from Putin and Zelenskyy and their New Year's Eve statements. Zelenskyy talked of peace, and he's the one who actually shows up time and time again in Washington, in places in Europe, to talk about getting to peace. Look what Putin says at his New Year's resolution, New Year's Eve speech. He talks about taking more of Ukraine and continuing the fight. I don't think that's the Russians showing that they're ready for peace at all.
There's another piece of the puzzle here too, of course. As we go to air, we're hearing these Ukrainian intelligence reports that Russia is preparing a large-scale provocation, including human casualties, to disrupt any further ceasefire talks. How seriously should the West take these kinds of warnings that the Kremlin could manufacture an incident in Russia and blame Ukraine?
Well, I think they should be taking these seriously, and I think fundamentally these actions we're seeing from Russia, this increasing rhetoric, is trying to regain the initiative. They're very unlikely happy with the process of the negotiations, and it looks like the Americans and the Ukrainians are increasing on the same sides with the negotiations. I would suggest that these are a signal from Moscow that it wants to be taken seriously. It wants to have these negotiations move in a different direction, and it will do things like stage attacks on one of Putin's residences, or call up, as you say, a potential attack and a false flag attack. Keep in mind, that's also how the Russians wanted to start their invasion of Ukraine in 2022 in the first place. It wasn't until the U.S. government released intelligence saying that a false flag attack could be likely as a means or casus belli for the Russians to invade Ukraine. So I would take this very seriously, and I would read into it the Russians not wanting to see these peace talks succeed.
I guess the question is then, could such tactics work? I mean, we've talked about Donald Trump. You mentioned Donald Trump having these conversations with Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump is widely regarded as someone who's usually swayed by his last contact or even his last phone call. I mean, could he be convinced to believe Moscow over Kyiv?
Look, I'm not going to speculate too far. It is true that there's the common refrain of Donald Trump listens to the last person who is in the room. He was apparently quite irritated.
The last year has proven that it's a possibility, right? That President Trump takes Vladimir Putin at his word.
I think so, but then most recently, look at this post that Donald Trump shared from the New York Post editorial showing that they called the attack a false flag, and Donald Trump seemed to suggest that he agreed with that position. So I do think, yes, Donald Trump is highly mercurial. He does change his tune frequently depending on who he talks to, but I think there is an upper limit there. I would be concerned about any sort of action and where Donald Trump falls, but I do think that there is not enough. There is options on the table besides just the fatalistic one.
Now, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but speaking of President Trump, it's now been almost a year since he returned to office, of course promising initially to end the Ukraine war in one day. He now says we're 95% of the way there. But in your view, has Donald Trump, who's this self-acclaimed man of business, of numbers, failed by his own metrics?
Well, I think that's a tough measure, partly because the metrics change so frequently with President Trump. You'll hear him talk about these 2-week intervals frequently. It is true that he said, I believe, he was going to solve the Ukraine issue in one day, no fewer than 80 some times when he was on the campaign trail, but has later come to say that this is a complicated one. So I do think he has found that this issue is much more difficult to solve than he probably initially anticipated. However, I think that the best case is a negotiated settlement that the Americans and the Ukrainians jointly agreed to. So I think anything to get us to that goal would be a metric of success.
James Batchik, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Europe Centre, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And that's all for World News tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for more. I'm Dahmen. Good night.